We could say that leading Israel is a lot like herding cats. Trying to figure out how you get close to 3,000 kids all on the bus to go on a road trip across a wilderness. That's a little bit the context of what we're looking at today in the story. And all along, all those folks that are with Moses along on this road trip, they're asking the question that we've heard how many times if you've ever ridden with small children in your back seat and you're going more than just to the corner store. Are we there yet? And if there's more than one, there's bickering, complaining, as for us, it was the four of us, me and my three sisters, in the back seat of my dad's red Studebaker station wagon. It wasn't all that big, and we didn't have seat belts, and so we all kind of jostled for places, trying to get near the window on those hot days, and it was always hot. Somebody was too close to somebody else, and so there's always that little, be quiet, or that hand that would come around and just pat us on the head. Not necessarily in those days, but we tried to get through, trying to get there. Are we there yet? If you've ever been on a road trip, you know how hard it is, especially if you make a wrong turn. You end up extending the length of the trip, and it doesn't help. But thankfully, so many of us today have the GPSs, that voice that tells us which way to turn and whether they need to recalculate because we made a wrong turn along the way. Well, we know that in the story, we get to look at the wanderings of Israel as Moses leads them to the promised land, a land filled with milk and honey. Today is the third week that we've been looking at the story of Moses. It's not that Moses is more important than any other folks that we just focused on for 1 week, but there's so much that is happening in this time period that we need to focus on these more than 1 week. And the part of the story we're looking at today covers the entire book of Deuteronomy. So let's catch up for where we've been so far. The Israelites, God's people, have been rescued from slavery in Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. They have been set free. They've been led through the desert by this guy named Moses. God is leading them. God is providing for them, pointing them in the direction of the promised land. God assured them that it's going to be a wonderful new home beyond their wildest dreams. Last week we saw that on the way there they stopped at Mount Sinai and Moses received the 10 Commandments. And so now the Israelites are on the road again. In the front of your book, you'll find, if you've got it here today, you can look at the map and get a sense of the Israelites on the road. The Israelites have left Egypt, and they passed through the Red Sea, and now they're headed south towards Mount Sinai. Then they start heading north once again to the land of Canaan, the same place where Abraham's journey had ended. It's interesting to note that the first leg of the journey from Egypt to Sinai took about 3 months. So we would think that it would only take 3 more months for them to get to Canaan, to the promised land, but we know, as we'll see, the journey takes much, much longer. If you've ever been on that road trip, you know that at some point you're getting close and the kids are asking, and so my mom or dad says, well, we're almost there. Just a few more minutes, and then we hit the traffic jam before we can get in Ocean City. And those few more minutes went on. It took a lot longer than we wanted. And so we realized that getting there is not the fun part. Well, the Israelites had been on this long trip that seemed forever to get there. Again, only took about 6 months at this point. They're complaining. It's hot out here. My legs are tired. There's nothing to eat. And they began to whine. We should have just stayed in Egypt. At least we had a bed. We had a roof over our head. At least we could have had fresh fruits and vegetables rather than this manna stuff. Are we ever going to get there? And God heard all the complaining, and Moses told the Israelites, what those parents said, hey, we're almost there, and guess what? They were. They had come to the edge. They were coming to the edge of where Canaan was just across the river. And so at that point, God said to Moses, well, you need to go check out the land because this land is occupied. And so they sent 12 spies. 12 because one from each of the tribes of Israel. And so they crossed into Canaan and they spied out the land. They began to look, and for 40 days they checked it out, and then they came back to give their report. And they came laden with the tremendous fruit and bounty of the land. Indeed, it was a land where things grew wonderfully, a rich and fertile land. And so they brought those things back, but at the same time, the spies couldn't agree on what would be the next step, now that they've been there. 10 of them said, "True, this land is awesome. The walls of the city that we're going to move in, they're wide and tall, and the people that live there are like giants. There's no way that we could ever take over that city." And you can imagine the negativity that began to spread throughout the camp when they heard these 10 spies give their version of the story. Have you ever been in that experience in your own life? In your workplace, somebody talks about what the boss did, and all of a sudden a group of folks decide that's really terrible. There's a couple folks who you haven't even heard of it from, but everyone's assuming this, or it could be about your teacher or the principal at your school where parents get together, or it could be in your neighborhood. We've been in those situations where the word gets out and people jump in and what's wrong, and they make decisions based on a little bit of information. Our stories are not that much different from what we read in the story. And it got so bad that the folks began to say, well, it would have been better if we had just died in Egypt. Now we've been brought here to die by the sword. Let's get a new leader. And so, we find that they went down that road just as we have so many times in our lives. But finally, the two other spies, Joshua and Caleb, allowed to give their report. A much different report. Similar in so many ways. They said, yes, you're right. The city is heavily fortified. And you're right, the people are like giants. What? Haven't you forgotten something? Haven't you forgotten God's promise that God will give us this land? Do you not remember that God is on our side? Have you forgotten that indeed, that this is a God that we've trusted already, and time and again there's been miracles, and God has provided everything we've needed up to this point? Where is your faith? So now God's people have a choice. Do we trust God or not? Are we willing to put our faith in God? Are we willing to follow the lead of the 10 and listen to the voice of the negative majority, or we're going to follow God's lead, which we see through Caleb and Joshua? Do we truly trust the promises God has made? And that's a choice that we all have to make, is it not? Are we going to listen to what God says? Or we listen to the voices in the society that says, hey, God's irrelevant. God's not part of our lives anymore. Are we willing to surrender our lives to the will and the ways of God? Or are we going to allow the questions and doubts and the unbeliefs to crowd in and decide our destiny? Are we going to go along with the majority, or are we going to stand firm on the promises of God? See, there's one truth that comes up again and again throughout the book of Deuteronomy, and it's this: unbelief leads to death, faith leads to life. Unbelief leads to death, but faith leads to life. We see this truth being played out in the decisions the Israelites made. Instead of standing firm on the promises of God, the majority wins. Fear wins out. Unbelief trumps faith. And so, they choose their own way over God's way. They refuse to believe that God's promises can be trusted. They even go far to say, let's kill those guys that gave us the report that we don't like. At this point, the Bible story tells us that the glory of God shows up. Has it ever happened to you? You're driving down the road seat, you're a kid, and you just push mom and dad too far, and dad pulls off the side of the road. And there's threats. If you don't stop it, we're going back home. Or even worse. Now, instead you realize there's a moment of decision being made on the side of the road. And so we find that once as God pulls Moses to the side of the road, and says, Moses, we need to talk about who's in your back seat. About 3 million irresponsible folks who are just complaining and just misbehaving. And so God and Moses have this heart-to-heart talk. What am I going to do with these folks? You can imagine as God is having this conversation with Moses. God is, like we've gotten this far. I just gave them the 10 Commandments. I provide everything they need. We're ready to that place I've been promising to them all these years. Maybe I should just kill them all on the spot. Wipe them out and start over. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Going back to Noah. What God did. But we find in the midst of this that Moses intercedes for the people, pleads with God to show His mercy once again. Because God is a God of love and a God of mercy. God chooses to forgive His people. But as we see time and time again, forgiveness comes also with accountability. Forgiveness comes at the same time, there's also consequences in the midst of what we've done that receives the forgiveness. Because of Israel's unbelief, God declares that none of them will be allowed to enter the promised land except for Joshua and Caleb, the 2 spies who believed. God sentences the people to wander for 40 years in the wilderness. Why 40 years? One for each of the days spent of spies in the promised land. Unfortunately, and ultimately, the entire generation that left the Egypt dies out in the wilderness, all because they did not choose to believe. Yes, God is a loving God, but God is also a righteous judge. Because God is holy, God will always do what is right and call His holy people to do the same. Now, we step back from our lower story perspective, which is our perspective. It might be tempting to conclude that God is mean-spirited. God enjoys punishing people. So what if Miriam and Aaron were a little jealous that God had chose their little brother to be God's spokesperson and leader? Can you really blame them? And what's the harm in grumbling about it to each other anyway? Well, as it turns out, from the upper story, from God's view, there's plenty of problems with that. And that's when we have to step back and understand what's going on here. From the beginning, we've seen that God created His garden because He wanted to have community with human beings. And God didn't give up with that just because Adam and Eve sinned, so God continued to work until this point now. We see that the whole purpose of Moses and this nation of Israel is that this would be God's people, God's nation, and a place where God could come and reside with Him. That is His ultimate vision. And so it has a lot to do with what God is trying to do, why God's not going to settle for where the people were and how they were acting. God is building this special nation, one that is different from all the other nations in the world, one that is worthy of God's physical presence with them. People in other nations complained. People in other nations were never satisfied, no matter how good they had it. People in other nations got jealous. People in other nations, hoarded and did everything just for themselves. But God's nation had